All right. Hello, everyone. We're ready to get started here. And it's great to see you all here today. Thank you very much for joining us for the first of three webinars about the importance of water data being facilitated by the Columbia Basin Water Hub and Living Lakes Canada. We would like to begin by introducing the Water Hub team to everyone present here today. As some of you may know, my name is Santiago, and I'm the Applied Innovation and Technology Manager at the Water Hub and Living Lakes. I am speaking to you today from Castlegar, British Columbia, and I would like to acknowledge that I live and work in the traditional territories of the Sonaiks, the Silks, the Tanaha, and the Secwepemc peoples. Now that you know me, I'll pass it on to Paige.
Hello, my name is Paige Thurston. I'm the Database and Community Engagement Coordinator with the Water Hub at Living Lakes Canada. I'm joining you today from Nelson, BC, on the territory of the Sinaiks, the Syilx, the Tinaha, and Secwepemc peoples. As the last few people join the webinar, please let us know where you're joining from in the chat box.
Awesome. Thank you, Paige. Oops, get that out of the screen. And as people continue to join the webinar, please take a moment to enter your location so we know where you're from. Great. See, we got some people from Nelson. That's great. From Rossland, Edmonton, Kimberly. Great. So fantastic. It looks like we have quite at the representation of a diversity of communities. So before we get started, please note that there will be time for a question and answer session after the presentations are finished. I encourage you to locate the question and answer function in your Zoom controls. As we move through the presentations, if you have any questions, please enter them there so we can answer your questions when we get to the Q&A at the end. We will also be recording this session, and the recording will be distributed with other resource documents to all registrants of the webinar. You'll also be able to find the recording on the Living Lakes Canada YouTube channel and website. We'll provide links to all those as well. All right, so this is our first webinar in our Why Care About Water Data webinar series, hosted by Living Lakes Canada. Living Lakes Canada is a national non-for-profit organization that is working towards the long-term protection of Canada's fresh water. Our mission is to elevate water stewardship through community-based water monitoring, as we believe that this is the way to empower localized climate action and adaptation, and provide support for decision-making by helping to fill important water data gaps. Here you can see a variety of our programs on the left, both at the national, Columbia Basin, and regional scales. Now, one of our current projects is the implementation of a unified water monitoring network and a framework in the Canadian Columbia Basin through a multi-year initiative called the Columbia Basin Water Monitoring Collaborative. Part of this project is the Columbia Basin Water Hub. It's a centralized repository for water data that Living Lakes Canada developed in consultation with hydrologists, governments, First Nations, and water stewardship groups. We officially launched the Water Hub in March of this year. Through the Water Hub, we make data accessible. Data which is necessary for the adaptation to the climate crisis upon us, increased watershed security, and environmental stewardship. The goal of this three-part series is to provide viewers with an overview of the importance of water data in the Columbia Basin in the context of the climate crisis, introduce a few of the fabulous community-based water monitors who are collecting this valuable data, and to highlight the importance of water data for decision-making. We encourage you all to reach out to us if you have any questions or would like to know more. In today's webinar, we will look at implementing a water balance approach in the Columbia Basin and the urgency around collecting water data for climate resilience. Kind of skip that slide, sorry there, everybody. Bringing many years of experience working with water data and climate change adaptation, we are happy to introduce Dr. Martin Carver and Greg Utzig as our guest speakers today. We begin with Martin. Martin Carver is a hydrologist and fluvial geomorphologist with a PhD from the University of British Columbia and over 25 years experience in water resources, emphasizing hydroelectric, forestry, mining, and oil and gas development in the Columbia, Peace, Athabasca, and Lar River systems. His areas of interest include environmental impact assessments, hydrologic risk analysis, biodiversity conservation, watershed assessment, water monitoring systems, and adapting to climate change. He has worked in Canada, Nepal, and Ecuador, and now works across Western Canada as an independent consultant based in Nelson, BC. Awesome, and with that, we'll pass it on to Martin.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Can you see the screen? Okay.
It's perfect. We can see it. Thank you, Martin.
I've entitled the talk today, The Essential Role of Water Monitoring Data in Supporting Resilience Amid Climate Disruption. You'll have to bear with me about my slightly scratchy voice. I'll try to speak slowly. So I'm going to give the first part of this talk and then hand it over to Greg. Now, understanding and measuring hydrologic variability. There's 2 points I'd like to make to kind of frame the talk. And the first is that consistent water flows are relied upon widely. The concept of stationarity is one in which the changes are occurring within an ongoing range of variability. So we rely on consistent water flows both for communities, our sustenance, our safety, our planning, and many things, and ecosystems, their functions in terms of habitats, life cycles, and other aspects. So this idea of stationarity and consistent water flows underpins everything we experience day to day. Now, structured long-term measurements. You can't manage what you don't measure. This is a very famous expression. And we have to just face it, the communities and ecosystems are both heavily managed. Information about the water flows, and by water flows, I'm also including all the other aspects of the hydrologic cycle, not just runoff, but information is especially important when the system is non-stationary. Okay, so the outline for my part of the talk then is twofold. I'll have a look at the status of our monitoring network in the Upper Columbia Basin. So the Upper Columbia Basin is the part of the basin that drains near Trail into the United States, both past and present, and with some ongoing gaps in the networks that exist. And then I want to talk about climate disruption and look at some examples in means and extremes of climate that are happening and its consequences for hydrologic variability and the need for monitoring. So a key message here is that there is an urgency to collect water data across the UCB, the Upper Columbia Basin, in a structured and science-based manner. So that theme will cut through my talk and we'll go into Greg's. So, first of all, I want to start with a little movie, and this is courtesy of Samuel Lister, a colleague in the Nelson area. And we're looking at the area from Arrow Reservoir across the Slocan Lake and across Kutenai Lake. So it's a southern portion of the Upper Columbia Basin. And what this movie will show is the history of hydrometric monitoring in this area going back to the 1900s. And you can see each dot is one of the federal stations. So here we are in the 1930s. It's picking up the 40s, 50s. And you actually start to see it drop off now. And that's roughly speaking the present network. So what you can see there is that it has not been consistent through time, and it generally is much smaller than it once was. There are a lot of stations no longer active. Now, just want to introduce the concept of the regional landscape. The definition of it is on the side there in the box. Greg will be referring to this concept a little bit too. And it's essentially an area of consistent climate. So you can see in the map here, all the black lines outline regional climates in the southern half of the UCB. And I'm focusing you in on one, which was largely covered in the previous movie. And in that Arrows, Slocan, Kootenai Lake regional landscape, here you can see a summary of the discontinued stations and the active hydrometric stations. And so today then we have that left standing within the regional landscape. So it gives you an idea of the scope of monitoring that is undertaken now. And these stations are largely on the larger systems. Oh, yeah. And here's the background to that statement, that if we look by year on the x-axis at the size of the stations of the watersheds that are being monitored, you can see that in recent years, the small and medium-sized watersheds have all but been removed from the monitoring networks. And so this theme is going to come up a bit later on as well. Now, stepping back though from that regional landscape to the upper Columbia Basin as a whole, we do see this trend overall of a kind of a peak in the 1980s of the scope of monitoring networks, and then a general decline. This isn't every kind of monitoring, but it's a cross-section: hydrometric, water quality, climate, and snow. And I thank Columbia Basin Trust for the slide. I prepared this as part of a study that I'll come back to in a few minutes. Yeah, okay, so I'm just going to very quickly, just to kind of concretize it a bit and give you 4 slides here showing the monitoring network, dated though to 4 years ago when this was put together. And so you can see the cryosphere here, the climate, snow, and glaciers. There are a number of glacier sites, some long-term climate stations, snow survey sites, and some seasonal sites. For water quantity, we have hydrometric stations, reservoirs being monitored, their levels, no lakes being monitored, and 5 OBS wells for groundwater. And again, this is 4 years old. There'll be some changes, but not a lot. And water quality then, there's a number of streams and reservoirs being monitored, and 3 groundwater wells, and many discontinued sites. Community-based monitoring, it tries to fill some of the gaps. It tends to be driven by local interest. It's focused on smaller streams, and it includes wetlands, groundwater, snow courses, and climate. And here there has been a number of changes around groundwater. All of this information is contained in a report that the CBT published that I authored in 2017 called Water Monitoring and Climate Change in the Upper Columbia Basin. So all those plots and a lot more are in there, but I'm just summarizing here on this slide, generally speaking, where the gaps are in the monitoring network across the entire UCB. And they tend to focus on small and medium-sized watersheds, climate stations at high elevation, snowfall and snowpack at mid and high elevation, glacier mass balance and rate of decline, monitoring almost in the entire northern region, and then monitoring and tracking of smaller lakes and wetlands, and evaporation rates and groundwater. So there's quite a list of monitoring gaps. Okay, now I want to shift gears. That's sort of a quick synopsis of the monitoring network. Now I want to talk about how things are changing with climate change. So we're all familiar with the ongoing and rather relentless increase in temperature that is occurring throughout our living areas on the planet, and is including the Upper Columbia Basin. So I want to go through 4 examples that highlight how the hydrologic cycle is changing as a result of climate change. And then this has implications for our monitoring needs. And I thank Greg Utzig for this slide. It comes from some work out of the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium. And we see here a reduction in snow cover shown in terms of snow water equivalent, which is for April 1st, between the 1970s and the 2050s. And you can see here in the slide that there is generally reductions expected, especially in the lower half of the UCB. On the right here, it shows the actual snow water equivalent in the 1970s in the top, and then you can see it drops in the Canadian part of the basin. Now we've got an international component here. The Canadian part, 3.6% by the 2020s, and then 11.5, and much steeper declines for your interest south of the border. So what happens to this? What happens as a result of this change in snow? Well, one of the most obvious things is the change in seasonal runoff. So this somewhat parallels the previous slide, and it shows the changes in winter, spring, summer, and fall runoff between the 1970s and the 2050s. And you can see that in the winter, we're going to be getting a lot more water when we don't really need it. In the spring, we'll be getting more water. In the summer, we'll be getting a lot less water. And in the fall, roughly the same. Now, is this actually happening? Because we're obviously well into that period on the way to the 2050s. So the next sequence of slides draws our attention to actual monitoring data that is available for the recent decade or so. And I thank Hans Schreier at UBC for sharing this bit of work with me in these slides. And what we see here then is the 18 hydrometric stations shown with 50-year records on the bottom left. And on the right, there are climate stations, and 10 are selected with 100-year records. And those two data sets are used in the next few slides to show, I'll tell you now, to show that these changes are happening in our systems now as a result of the increased temperature. So the first one, then I draw your attention to the Kaslo River. And what we have here then is 5 plots, each of which shows the monthly discharge in the river. So it goes from March, April on the left, from May to July on the right. And we see that the year of record for that metric, the monthly discharge in that month, it's now occurred in the last decade. Each one of them shown occurs in the last decade. And we even have the lowest year on record in 2015 for July. So there's one system, it's a larger system that we have monitored, and we're seeing the signature of these expected changes in runoff. Now the next two slides pull together the climate station data and the runoff. Look first to the left, and you see here, this is for June. You see the maximum daily temperature, the average for the month along the x-axis, and the precipitation, the total for the month on the y-axis. And the top plot is for Kaslo, the bottom plot is for Nelson. So they're, relatively near each other, an hour apart. And on the right, you see a nearby creek that is affected by what's happening on the left, you could say. And so we see within just the last few years, the last decade, that we have a very wet year, 2012, the wettest on record with this metric, precipitation in June. And sure enough, we see it showing up with a large rain event leading to the peak in 2012. And then similarly, we have the hottest on record, 2015. And here we see it showing up as the lowest or close to the lowest on record from very hot, dry conditions leading to record low discharge. So there's June. So we can do the same thing here with April. And maybe I'll just sort of go to the right side. We see this hot conditions in the month of April in 2016, leading to rapid snowmelt and a peak flow, a peak mean monthly discharge, for Redfish and Duhamel Creeks, which are near the climate stations. So the next 4 slides then kind of summarize what's happening. And it takes 2 climate metrics. Here we have the mean maximum monthly temperature for the 10 climate stations up and down on the left for each month of the year across the top. And we can see that these years of record for those cells are increasingly populated by recent years. This is for monthly precipitation. We see the same sort of thing. And if trends continue, I suppose we can expect essentially this whole tableau of cells to be populated with recent years. And we can also look at the monthly discharge in the 18 streams that are monitored with the 50-year record, and we see the same sort of thing, that these monthly discharge, the year of record, is showing up in recent years. So all that to say that this is very real and it's very much happening, but we largely know it for these larger systems. Now, my final example then, thanks to Greg for these next 3 slides, is about the Columbia Wetlands. So this is a Ramsar site, a wetland of international significance, and it's in the Rocky Mountain Trench. And we have here the area that essentially drains into the wetlands. The wetlands are the blue along the center of this slide. Then there's drainage coming in from the west in the Purcells and coming from the east, the Rocky Mountains. And you can see that all 3 areas, the temperatures are projected to increase by about 5 degrees, quite a bit, by the time the 2080s rolls around. So about a century of warming. And the consequences then? Well, here are 2 plots. First is precipitation in the center. And you can see that the historic is in the green and the 2050s and 2080s, depending on the projection for emissions, doesn't really matter. They both go down. And that's the point we're trying to make here, is that for the headwaters, the upper, mid, and the lower, we're going to see a lot more precipitation as rain, which means there'll be less storage going on in the watershed, which means water will arrive in those wetlands at a different timing. And meanwhile, down in the wetlands, the evaporation rates are changing. And so we can also expect to be losing a lot more water. And think about the water balance here. Think about what we know and what is being monitored. And lastly, on the Columbia Wetlands, then here is a map of the glaciers, all the red spots here. And you can see the glacier area from the headwaters to the upper, to the mid, to the lower. It's known that by the end of the century, more or less, we're expecting to lose most of our glaciers. And here we have on the bottom right then, the September stream flow is a good indicator of contribution from glaciers because the runoff in the Watershed is long gone. And if we take out the glaciers, we end up with the red line for the mean September flow. If with the glaciers, it's the blue line. And the difference here, the percentage on the right, is the gray. So we're expecting to lose about 20% of our September flow from the decline of the glaciers. Again, very significant for the wetlands. So why does all this matter? Well, I think it's probably pretty clear to you by now that it matters a lot because communities and ecosystems are highly affected by these water dynamics. Drinking water needs, agriculture, irrigation demands, flooding and landslides have consequences for infrastructure and public safety and other things. Many implications for aquatic habitats, forests and forest management, recreational uses, and the list goes on. There's so many reasons why these changes matter and why it's important to know about what's going on and know about the changes. Here's 2 examples. There was a landslide in Johnson's Landing in 2012 related to increased soil moisture. You'll recall that was a very wet year, and it killed people and destroyed homes and had major consequences in the North Kootenai Lake area. And also in 2013, there was a large precipitation event that went across southern BC and caused $5 billion worth of damage in Calgary, but it also left its imprint in the West Kootenai and East Kootenai. You see pictures here of Hamel Creek, Schroeder Creek, Fry Creek, others that were blown out by this heavy rain on snow event. I'm almost done here. So that's all very well. We need to know more about what's going on. But I just want to, as a segue for Greg's presentation, point out that hydrologic systems are already highly variable, even when they're stationary. The spatial and temporal variabilities of water resources is immense because there's many water bodies and fluxes between these bodies that need to be characterized. And in the Columbia Basin, we have a particularly high amount of variability, partly because of our topography in the north-south trending mountain ranges. So this is something that we have to come to terms with. And to that end, Living Lakes Canada drew together a collection of people interested in the topic, scientists, hydrologists, others, and hosted a workshop about 1 year ago today. And this is the proceedings of the workshop. It had a number of objectives. But the third objective is the one I want to just put here as a segue for Greg's talk, and that's the goal of identifying a process to rank the implementation of potential water-related monitoring in terms of both site locations and measured parameters, and describe a potential phased long-term implementation. Big goal, big objective, lots of tricky science in it. And I'd like to conclude with that and leave it for Greg.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Martin. Before I pass it on to Greg, I just want to remind everyone that if you have any questions for Martin, we have the Q&A box. And so if you just want to put your questions in there, we'll read them at the end of the presentation, so after Greg. And so with that, I would like to introduce Greg Utzig. Greg is a conservation ecologist and a land use planning consultant with over 45 years of experience in environmental impact assessment, watershed analysis, terrain and vegetation mapping, habitat inventory and modeling, and a wide range of activities related to forest management and biodiversity protection. At present, his focus is on adapting biodiversity conservation measures to the realities of rapid climate change. He has worked with a variety of clients, including government agencies, non-governmental organizations, First Nations, and the forest industry, both in British Columbia and in Southern Africa. Greg has degrees from the universities of Wisconsin and British Columbia in geology and forest soils. And with that, Greg, please take it away.
Hey, thanks for that introduction, Santiago. I'm presuming you can hear me okay at this point?
Yes, we can.
I'm going to follow on from Martin and basically talk about the process that we have proposed for laying out this water monitoring program for the Upper Columbia Basin. As Martin pointed out, and I think you all know, watersheds are complicated. There's lots of different pieces. And if we're going to understand how these watersheds are going to react to climate disruption, we have to have a better understanding of various parts of the watershed, and which is why we think monitoring is important. And why we think it's important that monitoring gets underway as soon as possible is because that lack of stationarity that Martin mentioned. Things are starting to change, but the rapidity with which they will change will increase dramatically. So the sooner we get started, the better. What we've chosen in terms of thinking about how we're going to do monitoring is to use the water balance approach. And the water balance approach basically tries to take what is a very complex system and pull out the pieces that we think are measurable and ones we think that display the major changes that will affect people and aquatic ecosystems. First of all, there's the inputs of precipitation and outputs of evaporation and transpiration, which is basically climate. So that's one aspect that we're very much need to be monitoring more. We have, Martin showed in his slides the lack of climate monitoring stations, particularly at high elevations throughout the Columbia Basin, and this has been historically true. Secondly, the other thing we usually think about when monitoring watersheds is discharge, the amount of water that's leaving the watershed through stream flow. And obviously that is the typical thing that is monitored with water monitoring. In addition to that, there's also sediment, which isn't really part of the water balance, but it's a factor that's extremely important, and it's often tied to precipitation and to the discharge rates, particularly peak flows. So we want to include that as well, although it's not part of the water balance per se, and it'll depend on the priorities, local priorities. Secondly, there's the storage basin. This one is a little bit trickier because it's underground and it's not obviously visible, but basically the aquifers within a watershed. And these are more typically a problem or something that needs to be monitored in larger watersheds in mountainous terrain, but can be significant. Storage can be significant in some of the smaller basins as well, and it's usually done through well monitoring. And then there's trying to get a feel, once you've measured that storage and the discharge and the input, is trying to figure out in any given year whether there's an exchange between the groundwater. Is there more water being stored, particularly in a wetter year, and in a drier year, is that groundwater augmenting the stream flow as well, and how large a role is it playing. So given that that's our kind of underlying approach, is the watershed balance, is how would we go about systematically setting up a water monitoring? I mean, there's thousands of watersheds that could be monitored in the Columbia Basin, and obviously we can't afford to do that, and we don't have time to do that. So how would we approach this in a way that meets local people's interests and needs, ranks areas that have important aquatic ecosystem priorities, and secondly, do it in a systematic scientific way that makes it efficient. So I'm going to go through this approach that we put together before the workshop that Martin mentioned a year ago. The approach was looked at the workshop. There was a lot of useful discussion and suggestions, and we've since revised our original proposal, and Living Lakes has put together a report which summarizes what I'm going to be presenting today, and that will be available to people to look at it in more detail. This will be a very quick thumbnail sketch of what's included in the proposal. First of all, is to pick out an area of interest, and Martin talked about that a bit with talking about regional landscapes. One of the main variables in how watersheds work, of course, is the inputs, and the climate is very important in that it also determines the seasonality of the outflows. So we want to pick an area of interest that's reasonably homogeneous in terms of climate. Secondly, we want to assemble our local reference group, which includes people who live in the area, who know the area and have particular concerns. First Nations interests, of course, are important. And lastly, we want to involve academics and government people, research people, because there are obviously research questions that they may see as important that local people may not be aware of, and they will assist in translating the local priorities into something that's measurable. Once we've established this group, is to try and figure out, well, which watersheds are we going to actually monitor, since we can't do them all. So one is to establish the watershed units of interest. Secondly, to stratify those so that we know, try and approximate which ones we think are likely to be reacting in a similar manner. And so we can stratify our sampling procedure to sample each of those different types, but not multiple ones within a type unless we've got funding to do that. And eventually we come together with some final selection criteria and come up with a final ranking of monitoring sites. And I'm just going to go through this in a bit more detail in the report. We have a table here which basically has the steps that we would follow to do such a thing. So first of all, is this picking the area of interest, which of course depends on the funder and whoever is actually controlling the overall program. And secondly is the need to assemble this local reference group. And in this diagram here, what it shows is where the local reference group has input and decision-making within these various steps to come up with a monitoring network. And on the left here, these bubbles are other inputs that are necessary to proceed with each of these steps. So we're going to quickly and systematically go through these steps to give you a feel for what we're talking about. In terms of regional landscapes, this is some mapping that I did a number of years ago, which basically breaks the Upper Columbia Basin into regional landscapes. And they are climatically based, but the way in which we did them, we used the surrogate of the biogeoclimatic mapping, which is a reflection of regional climate, to come up with the actual boundaries. And these can be grouped into larger regions. And in the case of the monitoring report that Martin did for CBT, we grouped them into hydrologic response regions, basically areas where the climate is similar and we expect the hydrologic response to be similar. So just what do they mean in terms of temperature? If we just look at some selected ones from the Columbia Basin, these is a plot of annual and seasonal precipitation. As you can see, there's a fair bit of variation. A couple of the southern ones have annual precipitation in the black lines about 600 millimeters, and whereas the wetter ones are upwards of approaching 900 or 1,000 millimeters. But also the seasonality changes dramatically, like the Northwest Columbia up in this area here. The vast majority of precipitation is in the winter. The other ones, winter is high, but not to the same extent up there. Fall is also much higher up there. But if you look at the Columbia Kootenai headwaters, this one over here, you can see precipitation is generally less. And in fact, the lowest precipitation is here in the summer versus in the Canoe. Summer precipitation is significantly higher. You can also look at seasonal temperatures. As you can see, summer temperatures are generally high across the region, but winter temperatures vary dramatically in the ones in the Rocky Mountain Trench closer to Alberta, more continental influences. We're looking at quite a bit colder winter temperatures. We're looking in those areas, and in all the areas actually, the other seasons are relatively similar, but there are differences between the regions. There's also changes in this summer climatic moisture deficit. In other words, how much water is taken out by evapotranspiration, which is what's available coming in precipitation. And in this case, you can see these are projected to increase dramatically over the coming decades, and they do vary across the hydrologic regions. And as Martin indicated in the slide for the Columbia Wetlands, the amount of precipitation falling as snow in the winter is also projected to decrease dramatically. But you can see it also varies across the region, that there's quite a bit of more snow in the Columbia Kootenai headwaters in terms of the percentage of winter precipitation because of those cold winter temperatures versus sort of the lower Columbia Kootenai, the area in the southern West Kootenays, where already we're only looking at 50% of our precipitation, winter precipitation coming in as snow. So in terms of trying to lay out a monitoring program for the basin as a whole, we decided to look at how one might divide up the basin using these regional landscapes and having some knowledge of where communities are located, where people are located. And from a costing point of view, we thought it was important to break down areas where there are likely to be volunteers, where accessibility to watersheds is quite reasonable, because of extensive roading systems, and which areas are more remote are probably going to be more expensive to monitor, but maybe a lower priority because there's less people in those areas. In this case, we end up with about this blue line is the Columbia Basin Trust region, which we were asked to look at. There's four, the ones outlined by blue dashed lines are what we consider to be backcountry areas for monitoring because there's few local communities. Whereas the red ones, and there's about a dozen of those, are what we consider to be front country where access to most streams is reasonable. Not all, but most. So we, in our work, were asked to suggest a couple of potential pilot areas. We picked out two in the East Kootenays. It is that area around the Columbia Wetlands that we presented that information for. Obviously, there's a priority for doing that because the wetlands are an extremely important natural asset. And secondly, from looking at the climate projections, it's an area which has potential issues, which are already beginning. In the West Kootenai, we chose this one here. It was the one we used in the workshop as well. Even though it includes portions of the three major valley systems, the Arrow, the Slocan, and Kootenai Lake, it is relatively uniform climate across that area, and therefore it makes sense as an area. Secondly, this portion of it, there's an ongoing program, which was originally the North Kootenai Lake Water Monitoring Project. It's now Kootenai's Watershed Science program under Living Lakes. There's already existing local non-governmental water monitoring set up in this area. We're monitoring 7 streams in the northern part of this area. So the next thing is, once you've chosen the area that you're actually going to pilot for your monitoring, is how do you determine the priorities? Well, this is where setting up that group, the reference group, is extremely important because they're the people that understand where the issues are within that region. But we also want to look at where have there been past monitoring. There's no point in duplicating information that already exists, or there's ongoing monitoring going on. And then within that, it's a matter of deciding which watersheds are you actually going to monitor. Well, you can look at the whole Columbia Basin, which would be this area here. This is the Columbia Basin in Canada, where CBT applies. Obviously, the Okanagan flows into the Columbia as well, but this is the CBT Basin. Or you could look at the Kutenai River system, which includes, of course, down into the States. Or you could look for a portion of that, like the Slocan, which are getting smaller. Or you can look at just the Slocan watershed, but that also is comprised of a whole series of watersheds. And again, it's these smaller watersheds which are lacking monitoring today. And looking at this area here in particular, you can realize that even going with that small, these little dots, each of these represent where people have water intakes. These two major watersheds which are located here, yes, there are water intakes on those, but people are getting water from lots of little tiny streams as well. So choosing which streams you're actually going to monitor is a tricky business, and at what scale you're going to do that. And that's why we think it's really important to look at it from a scientific point of view of how are these, which ones of these watersheds are likely to react in a similar manner, but also which ones are a priority because of potential issues for users. So these are kind of the typical kinds of things that we expect to be coming out from the local reference group. Obviously, where people are getting water is one consideration. And, you know, some of these larger watersheds that people are getting water from, they're made up of smaller watersheds. So do we need to monitor each one of those separately? Are we going to monitor these really small ones? And of course, Kootenai Lake, people are drawing water from Kootenai Lake as well. Secondly, there's flood risk issues. A lot of the communities in the Kootenays are built on the fans of streams, and peak flow and debris flooding in those streams is of extreme importance. That example that Martin showed earlier of the 2012 storm, most of those flood events were affecting fans, and some of them were communities where people lived. Other thing is obviously environmental priorities. This is an example from north end of Slocan Lake in the Bonanza Creek area. There's a series of wetlands here that are of importance for biodiversity. And this was a study where we looked at which ones of the small watersheds feeding those wetlands are most likely to be affected by climate change and likely to reduce flows into the wetlands. So that's just an example of another set of local priorities that may come to play. So in addition to understanding the local priorities, it's also a matter of understanding the watersheds themselves, and the idea to try and stratify those into watershed groups that we assume will have a similar runoff response. And that's mainly the science side of this approach, is how do we go about doing that? And first of all, it's establishing the watershed units of interest, which I just talked about in the previous slide, of what size, which ones, which types, and then trying to establish this database of the characteristics and indices of those various watersheds. Just using this example that we used in the workshop, we chose that as an area of interest. It's mid-range of climate, lots of topography and terrain complexity. There's some active glaciers. There's lots of small communities and rural populations using water, many living on fans, riparian zones, mainly depend on surface waters. So how do we go about characterizing those? In the report, we give examples of all these different characteristics which can be summarized and which part of the water balance they represent. So the idea is to create a database of all these different characteristics for all the watersheds of interest within the area of interest, and then use some kind of similarity analysis to group those or stratify them into groups that are likely to react in a similar way. And that way, when you lay out your monitoring plan, you have an idea of which ones are likely to react in a similar manner, and you try and make sure that your samples are distributed, that you cover that range of diversity, but don't duplicate it unnecessarily. This is an example of the outcome that we did for the workshop of looking summaries of those various characteristics. So we used the provincial watershed assessment watersheds as an example of the types of watersheds that they might want to do. And then these are the existing hydrometric and climate stations that exist in the area of interest today. So we know which ones are already being monitored. And then we looked at various different characteristics and created maps showing how those different characteristics varied from watershed to watershed throughout that area of interest. This is a soil mapping, which actually exists for that area. So we're able to get some idea of projecting infiltration and potential role of groundwater or not in those areas as well. It also can be useful in terms of predicting sediment responses. So the idea is to assemble all that data and then come up with some kind of stratification. Now, once we've got the scientific stratification and we've got the local priorities, it's to bring those two things together and actually try and choose which watersheds are the priority for putting in monitoring stations. But secondly, and most importantly, is not only which watersheds, but what are the parameters that we want to look at in terms of doing that monitoring? Is it worth monitoring the sediment, which of course is an added expense? Which ones do we need climate stations in? What kind of water monitoring are we going to need to do? Is there a suitable site? There's lots of further discussion that needs to go in, and this again is input from the local reference group. This is in the report. We provide some of the different kinds of criteria they might use to do that. All kinds of different factors that you want to take into account, obviously fisheries and other aquatic ecosystems, sediment issues, access, which has a big effect on cost, of course, complementarity to existing monitoring, and when you've got larger watersheds that are of interest, do we want to monitor some of the smaller watersheds within that watershed? And there's also these questions of ongoing disturbance. Do we want to try and pair watersheds, some with disturbance, some without disturbance? And do we get a generally good geographic distribution? So finally, you come up with a final list of which watersheds you come up with your priority and then begin to set up your system. But it's really important to keep in mind that as you know, and we're talking about running these monitoring stations for a minimum of 10 years to get a reasonable feeling for variability on an annual basis and to try and track climate change disruption as it begins to influence these systems. But during that 10-year period, we need to continually look at that data and assess our choices of watersheds and potentially go back and reevaluate if we might want to make some changes to that. And we might not have changed the parameters that we're measuring or how we're measuring them. So it's meant to be an iterative process as well as following the general track that we've put together here. And I think that's it for a quick summary. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Greg and Martin, for your awesome presentations. Now we can move on to a few questions. And we'll get started with a question from Rory Gallagher. This one was put towards Martin. He was wondering, Rory was kind of curious as to what methods would have been used in the first half century of the 1900s and how accurate they are. Weirs, perhaps, and how far back would time series flow data being collected? And so Martin already provided a question there. And Martin says that the Water Survey of Canada time series data records typically improve in the 1950s. And before that, methods and record keeping may have been inconsistent. And then that he suspects propeller and weir methods were common in the 1900s. And then alongside the same question was the role of modeling, such as using Raven in government decision-making, and whether or not that has an impact on how many stations we currently have, and if the modeling is enough for us to be able to know, and the government has made the decision that through modeling, the stations that we have suffice. And so Martin started answering the question about modeling and monitoring work and how they work together, and that reliable modeling outputs rely on field data. And this modeling allows us to estimate the dynamics in locations that are not monitored, and this is successfully done when sufficient field data are available to address the variability present in the system. And so I don't know, Martin, if you'd like to add a little bit towards the government comment. The actual question from Rory was, has government decided that their monitoring network is sufficient as they can just model the rest? And so Martin, I don't know if you'd like to address that, or Greg as well, you're welcome to jump on that.
I'll finish off. If you could turn on my video, I can turn the audio. I can't speak for government, obviously, I don't work for government, but I think it's pretty good guess that the modeling is used heavily because it's less expensive, but also it's more comprehensive. We do have to model. We will never monitor everywhere. We will be modeling. It's just a matter of the balance. And does the modeling have enough field data to address the variabilities and the calibration and validation that is needed with modeling?
Awesome. Thank you, Martin. And now we'll move on to a question from Tracy Flynn. This one is towards Greg from Greg's presentation. She says that on the hydrologic regions and climates slide, the Columbia Kutenai headwaters, I assume it's the C-K, show lowest precipitation in the spring, but however, Greg said that it was during the summer. And then summer makes more sense, and she was just wondering which one is it?
Sorry, the Columbia Kutenai headwaters, it actually is spring. It's the influence of being more continental than other parts. In other parts of the basin, most other parts of the basin, it is summer. But the Columbia Kutenai headwaters, which is basically an area around Canal Flats and east into the Rockies, again, has that influence, the continental influence. If I said summer, I misspoke.
Right on. Thank you, Greg. And then our next question is, this can go to either Martin or Greg. What is an approximate timeline to establish a priority monitoring network in a selected sub-basin or region? Initial installation, is 6 months reasonable? How long before significant water information is collected? 5 years, 10 years, 30, etc. And this is from an anonymous attendee. And so if you just maybe like to let us know in the chat who you are, if not, anonymity.
Well, I can
go ahead.
I can start. I think 6 months might be pretty quick, but it depends on when you start. You know, if you start in October and you've got all winter to establish your reference committee and you assemble your funding and work through all the processes, you probably could start installing in the spring. But, you know, if you start in the spring, you're not going to be installing till the following spring. You're unlikely to be doing installation in the winter. So, you know, somewhere between 6 months and a year, I think would be reasonable. You know, we would say that 10 years would be a minimum amount of time to get really good information. But having said that, by the time you've got 5 years of data, particularly if you've had some significant extreme events during that 5-year period, you've probably got information that's important in that shorter period. But ideally, we're talking minimum of 10 and hopefully longer.
Yeah, just to add to that final point, we in a stationary environment, we often want, let's say, a wet year, an average year, and a dry year. We're not in a stationary environment now, so things will just keep changing. But I agree with the timeframes that Greg laid out, keeping in mind that it'll be ongoing.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, with that, thank you, Greg and Martin, for your answers. We have time for one more question. And this one is from Nancy. And sorry, before I go into that one, just let you know if there are more questions in there, we'll go through them and answer in our follow-up email. And so this last question is, how are you using monitoring being done from local groups? Are you working with those groups to make sure similar usable data is being collected? And so maybe before I jump into Martin and Greg, I can answer a little bit about the WaterHub's role in trying to create a little bit of a standard for collection. And so through the WaterHub, we have data upload templates through which we try to ensure that the formatting of data is very usable, as well as ensuring that we acquire metadata for various sensors to ensure that research that is being done can be compared between the two, and slowly creating programs to help various groups to create consistent monitoring methodologies. And so that's part of the involvement the Water Hub has with that. But for the first part of the question, Martin and Greg, I'll let you take that one.
I'll start out, Greg, and then I'll pass it to you. Definitely, this method takes advantage of interest and monitoring undertaken by local groups. The point, though, is that it also has to make sense within the stratified framework scientifically. So, for instance, you wouldn't want to monitor a collection of watersheds which are basically telling us the same thing. On the other hand, you don't want to go out and monitor watersheds where there's no local interest. So there's a balance between these, and that's the fundamental role of the marriage of the reference group with the scientific principles that are in the stratification that Greg described. Greg?
I don't really have anything to add. That's good.
Awesome, great, thank you. And sorry, my tongue was a little bit off, and I get nervous with so many people watching me. And so we have time for a few more questions here. We have a question from Lori Ladd, and she's just wondering about any patterns in government funding for this important research. Are there trends in terms of funding available? Is there a need to lobby our politicians for more money for research and development to collect and model watershed data? Is there a role for citizens and volunteers here? Anybody?
Well, I would just say that Living Lakes is actively looking for funding to implement this program. They've been working with government people as well as Columbia Basin Trust. And those discussions are ongoing. And in terms of roles for volunteers, absolutely. I mean, in terms of the proposal that we laid out, that reference groups in each of those areas where monitoring would take place would include volunteers and particular organizations that may have an interest in water monitoring. And hopefully once the priorities are established, it's decided which watersheds are going to be monitored. There's clearly a role for local people to be involved in that because it's so much more cost effective to have local people involved in the actual field work in the monitoring. We've been fairly successful with the pilot project that we carried out in the North Kutenai Lake area. We've had volunteers actively involved in our snow surveys as well as checking the monitoring stations and an installation of monitoring stations actually. And I think having local people involved is essential to keep the cost down, but also because they know the areas and they often have information that people coming from the outside wouldn't have. So yes, for sure.
Awesome, thank you, Greg, for that answer. Martin, do you have anything to add?
Just to say, government is supportive of what we're doing, what Living Lakes is doing, and they attended the workshop as well last year, and we're very supportive of the direction this was going in my view.
Awesome, great. Now with that, we'll move to another question. Another anonymous attendee. What are the current barriers to collecting the data that we desire or that is desired?
Well, I'd just say quickly that funding is the fundamental barrier. But to be fair, funders, including government, but funders need to know that the money is being wisely spent. So I think that this method, this approach is attempting to demonstrate how to wisely spend money to get a lot out of it for managing changing resources and communities.
Awesome, great, thank you. And then we go to another question from Wendy King. She's wondering, what role do you see the permanence of our subalpine and alpine wetlands playing in the long run?
Well, I guess my first question would be, can we depend on permanence with climate disruption and changes in not only climate, but we're looking at changes in ecosystems, and the alpine and subalpine itself may disappear depending on which way climate change proceeds. I've done quite a bit of looking at changes in ecosystems as a result of climate change, and in some of the projections, the alpine systems completely change. I don't think we have a clear answer to your question as to what role they will play. That's why we think monitoring is important. the idea is that monitoring will help us understand and maybe in the future be able to answer your question.
Great, thank you. We got just two more questions, so just bear with us here. One of them is satellite. This is from Al Pankratz. Sorry if I just butchered your last name. Satellite remote sensing and weather radar fill in gaps regarding precipitation inputs. Can satellites also provide surrogate data that supplements hydrometric measurements?
I think there's no question that some satellite information can be useful, particularly around looking at snow. I haven't seen it used directly in the Columbia Basin here or the upper Columbia Basin, but I know in the United States, I've seen some studies that have looked at snow coverage based on satellite information. There's no question that remote sensing can assist in various aspects of this. It's getting access to that data. And again, that's a funding question and expertise question, but yeah, sure.
And typically they're coupled with a hydrologic model if you actually want to know about runoff, like stream flow. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you. And now we can move on to our last question. There are numerous existing models created for the Columbia Basin. How are they insufficient?
I'll throw a first answer out to this. It's a little hard to know what to respond to without knowing about the specific models, but just in general, models are not available to everybody, and models don't apply to every scale, and models require data to calibrate and validate them. So depending on the model that we're talking about, there may be gaps related to any of those three areas that I just mentioned.
I'll just add to that. If you look at the proceedings from the workshop a year ago, we actually did a very brief summary of the various modeling systems that are available for the Columbia Basin. And as Martin said, yeah, they're good as far as they go, but they depend on data. And as you noted in Martin's presentation, there's not much data being made available as watersheds change because we're not monitoring small watersheds at all. So they will be based on data that is historic and assumes stationarity that doesn't exist anymore. So therefore we need to collect more data.
Great. Well, thank you very much to our panelists. And now we just got some closing remarks. Just wanted to say thank you to Martin and Greg for the wonderful presentations and for your time. And then I just want to say that here at the Columbia Basin Water Hub, we're working hard to make this much needed data available to decision makers and the public so it can become utilized. Now we have placed the link to the Water Hub in the chat box so you can visit us. And new data sets are being added as we engage and collaborate with various groups and organizations within the basin. We really encourage you to visit us and get in contact with us if you have any data. And if, like I said, if you're interested, please get in contact with either myself or Paige. And I want to thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time and attention and tuning in to learn about the need for water data as our communities adapt to climate change. Thank you to our sponsors, including RBC, the Real Estate Foundation, the Columbia Basin Trust, Watersheds BC, the Sitka Foundation, and the Vancouver Foundation for making this webinar series possible. We will follow up early next week with the webinar package that includes the resources mentioned in today's session and a recording of the webinar too. Here at the Water Hub, we love using webinars to bring ideas and people together. This is our second series of many to come, with the next series taking place in the fall and focusing around the Columbia River Treaty. So with that, have a great day, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session, where we will spotlight 3 water monitoring programs from across the Columbia Basin, and then followed by a final presentation in the series with examples of data leading to applied decisions. Goodbye.